Hello, welcome to the Rainbow Dash template tutorial. Here you will learn about the Rainbow Dash templates. This video will introduce how to implement the effect of the checkpoint mechanism through the use of codes. Alright, let's get started. The effect of the checkpoint. When the player dies or touches the mechanism, the player will be teleported to the previous checkpoint. So how to achieve this effect? We first put 5 cube parts in the scene. Adjust their position, size, and color. Modify their names under the game resources view. Note that the names should not be repeated. The left 2 cube parts are checkpoints, and name them Report Part 1 and Report Part 2 respectively. The right 2 cube parts are teleportation mechanisms, and name them Trap Part 1 and Trap Part 2 respectively. The middle one is the death mechanism, and name it Dead Part. Let's observe the effect of the checkpoint. Players have to touch the parts to have the subsequent effect. Therefore, we will complete the logic for obtaining the parts. Click Game Settings, select Triggers and Scripts, click Server Script Management. Create a server script by clicking on New Lewis script in the upper right corner, and change its name to Record Part. Double-click the script to open the script editor. First, we define a Record Part module. Although the editor allows module names and script names to be different, but we still recommend keeping the two names the same for better project management. Then we need to define some variables. Variables Report Part 1 and Report Part 2 correspond to the 2 checkpoints in the scene. Variables Trap Part 1 and Trap Part 2 correspond to the 2 teleportation mechanisms in the scene. Position is used to store the last touch checkpoint. Next, define another externally accessible function start and get the function a map parameter. Inside the function, we call the FindFirstChild function with the root property of the map parameter to get the parts related to the checkpoint in the scene. Save the code, and we open the server's main script. We define a Report Part variable. Use the required keyword to load the Report Part module, and assign it to the Report Part variable. Next, we define a map variable to store the current map. Use the getStaticMap function of the world class to get the current map. For the ID of the map, we can get it by right-clicking Copy ID in the Game Resources view. To avoid the problem where the game object is not fully loaded when the players enter the game, we can set a timer and wait for 160 frames before calling the Report Part module startup function. When the player steps on the checkpoint, set the position of this part as the player's checkpoint position. When the player falls, the player is teleported back to the checkpoint position. Such an effect requires the use of collision trigger to achieve. We first write a local function, setRebirth, in which we write the logic for setting the checkpoint. The editor provides 2 functions for registering collision detection triggers, namely, the register handler function and the add handler function of the trigger class. The difference between the two is that the register handler function overwrites the existing triggers with the same trigger name, while the add handler function saves all the triggers with the same name in the trigger queue, and calls the triggers saved in the trigger queue in turn when activated. Because players colliding with different parts need to create different effects, so we use the add handler function. The add handler function has 3 parameters. The first parameter is the configuration information of the activating trigger object. Here we get the player's configuration information through the entity.getConfig function. The second parameter is the trigger name. Here we use the trigger when the entity starts touching the part. The third parameter is the callback function to be executed after the trigger is activated. Note that the trigger name parameter is built in by the editor. More detailed information can be found in the official API documentation. According to the API documentation, the processing of callback function has 1 parameter. The Object1 field of this parameter indicates the object that activated the trigger, which in this case is the player. The Part field of this parameter indicates the part that collided with the player, which in this case is the checkpoint we set. Because there will be many parts in the game scene, so we have to determine whether the parts colliding with the player and the checkpoint are the same checkpoint we set or not. If it's the checkpoint we set, then we first obtain the current position of this part. For the position of the part, we can get it from the world position property of the part. Then we will set the player's respawn position with the set rebirth position function. The set rebirth position function requires two parameters. One parameter is the respawn position. Here we fill in the position of the currently touched part. Another parameter is the respawn map. The default value is the map where the player entity is located. Here we can leave it out. We call this function in the start function. Save the code, go back to the game and test the code. As you can see, the player is teleported back to the touch checkpoint after death. At this point, we have finished setting up the respawn checkpoint. We move on to define a local function, change position. We still apply the function to the collision detection trigger. The specific collision function settings are the same as those described earlier. But the logic of the callback function here is different. We have to determine whether the parts we touch are the parts of the mechanism we set up or not. If it's mechanism parts, we teleport the player's position back to the checkpoint. The function we use here is setPosition, and we pass in the coordinates of the respawn point. Similarly, we need to call this function in the start function. We save the code after completing it, return to the editor and run the game to check the effects. As you can see, the player is teleported back to the last touch checkpoint after touching the mechanism. This is all the content of this video. I hope this content can help you make better games. To learn more about the content related to the Rainbow Dash template, you can leave a comment below the video, or post it on the official forum. See you in the next video.